"We will never stand next to you. You are the disgrace of this family." My dad refused to attend my Silver Star ceremony, so I gave his VIP seat to my aunt instead. On live TV, the Pentagon surprised her with an incredibly valuable gift. Just 1 hour later, my phone screen flashed 49 missed calls from my parents. My dad said that an hour before the ceremony started, standing in my kitchen in his good jacket, the one he only wore for things he wanted people to remember him wearing. He'd worn it to my brother's college graduation. He'd worn it to a cousin's wedding where he gave a toast that was really about himself. He was wearing it now for a ceremony he had already decided not to attend, which told me everything about what the jacket actually meant to him. It wasn't for me. It was never for me. It was for whoever was watching him wear it. He'd found out an hour earlier that I was giving my aunt his VIP seat. The invitation had come in a thick cream envelope 2 weeks prior, embossed with a gold seal, and it had 2 names printed on the enclosed card in careful calligraphy, his and my mother's. 2 seats, front row, reserved for immediate family. I'd sat at my kitchen table the night before with a pen in my hand for longer than I want to admit, looking at his printed name, before I crossed it out in blue ink and wrote my aunt's name in the blank space beside it. "You don't get to do that," he said, holding the card up like it was evidence in a trial. "That seat has our name on it, our family's name. It has a blank line," I said. "I filled it in with someone who earned it." "Earned it?" He laughed, but it wasn't really a laugh, more of an exhale with contempt built into it. "You don't earn a seat by being nice to someone in a hospital. That's not how this works. Your mother and I are your parents. We're the ones who raised you, who put a roof over your head for 18 years, who paid for your braces and your car insurance and every single thing you needed before the army ever laid a hand on you." I didn't say anything right away. I was thinking about a specific Tuesday 3 years back when I'd been lying in a hospital bed with my left arm in a brace I couldn't move, and how the roof over my head and the braces on my teeth hadn't done a single thing for me in that room. Those were investments made a long time ago, in a version of me that didn't need anything difficult from either of them yet. "She drove 6 hours round trip every Saturday for 4 months, I said. "You visited twice. Both times you left before the nurse came back with my pain medication because you didn't want to see what that looked like." His face did something complicated, a flicker of something that might have been shame if he'd let it stay long enough to become shame, instead of just passing through on its way to anger. "That's not fair. Your mother has a job. I have a job. We can't just drop everything." "She has a job too," I said. "She teaches night classes at the community college. She rearranged her entire schedule for 4 months so she could be there on Saturdays. You didn't rearrange anything. You visited twice because visiting twice was the minimum number of times you could show up and still tell people at work that you'd been to see me. This is exactly the kind of disrespect I'm talking about." His voice was rising now, filling the kitchen the way it always did when an argument stopped being about facts and started being about who could be loudest. "You don't talk to your father this way. Not after everything we've done for this family. Not after everything I've sacrificed to make sure you and your brother had everything you needed. If you do this," he said, and his voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted something to sound like a warning instead of a threat, though it was always both. "You are choosing the wrong side of this family. Do you understand me? You are going to regret this the second those cameras start rolling and the world sees who is actually sitting in that chair instead of your own parents." He went back to the roof over my head, and the 18 years and the disgrace of it all, running through the same points on a loop like a recording that had gotten stuck. The exact argument we'd just had, word for word, as though repeating it a second time might land differently than the first. I picked up my aunt's garment bag off the hook by the back door, the navy dress she was going to wear folded carefully inside a plastic sleeve, and I slung it over my shoulder. "I have to go," I said. "The car is waiting." "We will never stand next to you," he said, as I opened the door, the cold morning air rushing in past me into the kitchen. "You are the disgrace of this family." I didn't turn around to answer that one. I stepped outside, pulled the door shut behind me, and walked down the driveway to where my aunt was already waiting in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the house with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. I got in, put the garment bag in the back seat, and pulled out of the driveway without looking back at the kitchen window. The invitation itself deserves some explanation, because the 2 front row seats weren't just a formality. In these ceremonies, the department sends a fixed number of VIP passes to the honoree, and the honoree fills in the names. It's meant for immediate family, the people who are supposed to have stood behind you through whatever got you to the stage in the first place. There's no rule that says it has to be your parents. There's no rule that says it has to be blood at all. It just has to be someone who was actually there. I'd known for 2 weeks that my dad and my mom were going to be a problem about this, because I'd known for 2 weeks that neither of them had been there, not in any way that counted, and giving them the seats anyway would have been its own kind of lie. My family has always had a particular relationship with credit. Whoever shows up in the photograph is whoever gets remembered as having done the thing, regardless of who actually did the thing. My dad had spent 30 years perfecting this. He would show up for the last 5 minutes of an event, stand in the right spot when the camera came around, and somehow, in the retelling, he'd been there the whole time, present for all of it. Instrumental, even. My brother got the better version of this arrangement. He was 2 years older than me, better at sports growing up, better at the version of masculinity my dad understood and approved of. When my brother made varsity, my dad went to every game. When my brother got into the state university on a partial scholarship, my dad told everyone at his office it was a full ride, and nobody corrected him because nobody in that office had any reason to know better. My brother, to his credit, never really pushed back on any of it. He liked being the version of himself my dad wanted to talk about. It made things easier for him, and I don't blame him for wanting things to be easier. I was a different kind of child to manage. I asked questions. questions. I noticed inconsistencies and said them out loud, which in a house like ours was treated less like honesty and more like a character flaw. I wasn't as good at sports, and I wasn't as easy to be proud of in the specific, portable way my dad liked to be proud of things, the kind of pride you could mention to a coworker in the break room without it requiring any further explanation. So when I enlisted, right out of high school, my dad's reaction was somewhere between confusion and mild embarrassment. It wasn't the plan he'd had in his head for either of his kids. He came around to it slowly, and only really once he found a way to make it sound impressive at parties, once he learned which parts of military service sound good in casual conversation and which parts he could leave out. What he never adjusted to was the part where it actually cost me something. He liked the idea of a daughter in uniform. He did not like the reality of a daughter who came home in pieces, who needed things from him that couldn't be summarized in one sentence at a dinner party. My aunt was different from the start. She's my mother's older sister, and the two of them have never been close, which made her presence in my life always feel a little bit like something my mother tolerated rather than encouraged. My aunt never had kids of her own. She teaches night classes and early childhood education at the community college, has for almost 20 years, and she has a specific kind of patience that I think comes from spending decades around people who are still learning how to be patient themselves. She was the one who drove me to my first duty station when I turned 18, because my parents had a work conflict that weekend that later turned out to be a golf outing. She was the one who sent care packages overseas that weren't performative, just useful. Socks, dry shampoo, a paperback novel, a handwritten note that never asked me for anything and never mentioned money. I want to be precise about something here, because it matters for what happens later. My aunt never positioned herself as the better parent. She never said a word against my mom or my dad, not once, not even when it would have been easy and justified. She just kept showing up quietly, in the specific and consistent way that never made the news in our family because it never asked to be noticed. The morning I decided to cross my dad's name off that invitation, I called my aunt first, before I told anyone else, to ask if she'd even want to come. I remember she was quiet on the phone for a long moment, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "You don't have to do this," she said finally. "I don't need the seat to know you appreciate what I did." "I know I don't have to," I said. "I want to. It's not charity, it's just accuracy." She laughed a little at that, a small surprised sound. "Accuracy," she repeated. "All right, I'll come." I didn't tell her that morning that I'd already decided this wasn't only about the seat. I'd decided that whatever happened at that ceremony, whoever ended up standing next to me when the cameras were rolling, it was going to be the truth for once, not the version of the truth my dad had spent 30 years constructing for public consumption. 3 years earlier, my unit was running a routine security patrol near a checkpoint outside a forward operating base when a vehicle-borne device went off roughly 40 meters from our position. I don't remember the sound of it, which is strange because everyone who's been close to something like that always describes the sound first. What I remember is the pressure, a wall of air that hit before anything else registered, and then the ground under my boots not being where I expected it to be anymore. I was thrown into a low concrete barrier. My left arm took most of the impact, and it shattered in 3 places, the kind of break that requires more than one surgery and more than one specialist and a recovery timeline measured in months instead of weeks. 2 other soldiers in my unit were hurt worse than I was. One of them didn't make it home. I don't talk about him much, not because I don't think about him, but because some things belong to the people who were actually there with him at the end, and I wasn't one of them. I spent 4 months at a military hospital stateside, most of it in a single room with a window that looked out over a parking lot, which became the entire scope of my outside world for longer than I like to remember. The first surgery reset the bones. The second one, 6 weeks later, addressed complications from the first. In between, there was physical therapy that felt less like healing and more like a slow, deliberate argument with my own body about what it was still capable of doing. My parents visited twice in those 4 months. I want to be fair about this, because fairness matters even when it's uncomfortable. My dad has never been good in hospitals. He gets pale and quiet and finds reasons to check his phone, and I think some of that discomfort is genuine rather than performed. But genuine discomfort isn't the same as absence, and he chose the absence anyway, both times, checking his phone for exactly the amount of time it took to make his visit socially acceptable before he found a reason to leave. My mother came with him both times. She brought flowers on the second visit, the kind you buy from a hospital gift shop because you didn't plan ahead, and she took a photograph of them on the windowsill before she left, which she later posted online with a caption about how proud she was of her brave daughter. She left 40 minutes after arriving, before the nurse came back with my afternoon medication, because she said the smell of the hospital was giving her a headache. My aunt came every single Saturday for 4 months. She lived 2 states over, which meant a 3-hour drive each way, 6 hours round trip, every week for 16 consecutive weekends, without a single one missed. She never once mentioned the drive like it was a burden. She'd arrive with a crossword book, because she'd noticed early on that I couldn't hold a pen steady enough yet to do much of anything else, and we would sit there for hours, working through clues neither of us was particularly good at, laughing at how badly we were doing, filling in wrong answers and erasing them and trying again. On the days when the pain medication made the words swim on the page, she'd read the clues out loud instead and let me say the answers rather than write them, so it still counted as something we'd finished together. Even on the days my hands weren't cooperating with the rest of the plan, she never asked about my disability rating. She never asked when I'd be promoted, or when the money from any of it would start coming in, or what my long-term prognosis meant for my career trajectory. Those were the first questions my dad asked, on his second visit, before he'd even sat down. How this was going to affect my pay grade, whether I'd still be eligible for the benefits package he'd heard about from a coworker whose son had also enlisted. He asked these questions while I still had a cast on my arm and a chart at the foot of my bed that neither of my parents ever once looked at. My aunt looked at the chart. She asked the nurse actual questions about the healing timeline, about what kind of physical therapy I'd need once I was discharged, about whether there were exercises we could start doing early to keep the joint from stiffening. She wrote the answers down in a small notebook she kept in her purse because she said she wanted to remember them accurately instead of trusting her memory for something this important. That's the whole reason the seat was hers long before my dad ever refused it outright. He just made the decision official 3 years later, standing in my kitchen in a jacket he'd chosen specifically for a ceremony he had no intention of attending. The drive to base that morning was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than uncomfortable. My aunt kept smoothing the same wrinkle out of her sleeve over and over, an old habit I recognized from the hospital, from the hours we'd spent together in that room with the parking lot view. She wasn't nervous about the ceremony, I don't think. She'd never been the type to seek out attention, and a stage full of generals and cameras wasn't a place she'd have chosen for herself if the choice had been entirely hers to make. "You didn't have to do this," she said again, about 20 minutes into the drive, watching the highway go by. "I know," I said. "I wanted to. I mean it. I'm happy to watch it on television. I don't need to be sitting in the front row for it to mean something to me." "It's not about what you need," I said. "It's about what's true. You were there." He wasn't. The seat should reflect that, or the seat doesn't mean anything at all. She was quiet for a while after that, looking out the window at the fields going by, and then she said something I've thought about a lot since. "Your dad isn't a bad man," she said. "I want you to know I don't think that. He's just a man who learned a long time ago that showing up for the photograph matters more than showing up for the person, and nobody ever corrected him on it, so he never had a reason to change. I'm not asking you to think he's a bad man," I said. "I'm asking the seat to go to the person who was actually there." She didn't argue with that. She just nodded and reached over and squeezed my hand once before letting go. I want to give some context on her own life here because it matters for what comes later, and because she deserves more than being understood only in relation to what she did for me. She never married. There was someone once years before I was born, and from what little my mother has said about it over the years, it ended badly enough that my aunt didn't talk about it and my mother learned not to ask. She built a life instead around her students, around the community college where she's taught for 2 decades, around a small circle of friends she's kept since college who she still sees every few months for dinner. She lives modestly. Her car is 12 years old and makes a sound on cold mornings that she's been meaning to get looked at for longer than either of us wants to admit. Her apartment is small, 1 bedroom, decorated mostly with things her students have given her over the years. A ceramic mug shaped like an elephant, a framed drawing of a garden done in crayon by a 5-year-old who's probably in college himself by now. She has never, in the entire time I've known her, asked anyone for anything she couldn't get for herself. This is important context for what the Pentagon did later, because it wasn't a gift given to someone who was already comfortable, already recognized, already accustomed to institutions noticing her. It was given to a woman who drove a car with a strange sound in the engine to a hospital room every Saturday for 4 months because nobody else in the family was going to do it, and who would have been perfectly content if nobody outside that hospital room had ever known. We pulled into the base parking lot a little before noon. The lot was fuller than usual, more cars than a typical Tuesday would bring, and I could see the press vans set up near the auditorium entrance, satellite dishes angled toward the sky. My aunt looked at all of it for a long moment before she spoke. "I didn't realize it would be this big," she said. "It's not usually," I said. "This one's getting more coverage than most. I think it's a slow news week." She laughed at that, a real laugh, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders. We got out of the car. I grabbed the garment bag from the back seat and handed it to her, and we walked toward the entrance together, past the press vans, past a cluster of uniformed officers standing near the doors, into the building where, in a few hours, everything about how our family understood itself was going to change. The ceremony itself was smaller than the parking lot had suggested, at least in terms of the room itself, though the room was dense with exactly the kind of people you'd expect. Senior officers in dress uniform, a scattering of press credentials, family members of other honorees being recognized that same day, though I was the only one being awarded a Silver Star at this particular event. Folding chairs had been set in careful rows, and at the front, a podium with a department seal on it, and behind that, a long table where the ranking officers would sit until it was time for the actual presentation. My aunt and I were shown to the front row, to the seats with our family's name on the small printed card taped to the back, and she sat down carefully, smoothing her navy dress, glancing around the room like she was trying to memorize it. I sat beside her, and for a few minutes before the ceremony began, neither of us said much. There wasn't much left to say. We'd said what needed saying in the car. A colonel opened the proceedings with some general remarks about the unit, about the broader deployment, about the values the ceremony was meant to honor. Then a 4-star general took the podium, and the room went from polite attentiveness to something closer to real silence, the kind that happens when everyone senses the actual content is about to start. He read my file aloud, not a summary, not a paraphrase, but the actual after-action report, word for word, in the flat and unemotional tone that these documents are always written in, which somehow makes the events themselves sound even more severe by contrast. The vehicle-borne device, the concrete barrier, the 3 fractures in my left arm, the soldier who didn't make it home, whose name he read with a pause afterward that the whole room seemed to observe together, a small collective silence that felt like the only appropriate response available. He talked about the 4 months of recovery. He talked about about my return to active duty 11 months after the injury, against the recommendation of at least one specialist who thought I should have taken a medical discharge instead. He talked about the decision to return to my unit to finish out the deployment I'd started, because I didn't want the story of my service to end with an explosion instead of with a choice I made myself. Then he closed the folder, and I assumed that was it, the part where he'd call me up to receive the actual medal. Instead, he paused, adjusted the microphone slightly, and said there was one more matter to address before the ceremony moved forward. Before we present the medal, he said, there's a second announcement tonight, and I'd like to ask any family members present to remain seated for it specifically. I glanced at my aunt. She looked as uncertain as I felt. Nobody had briefed either of us on a second item. The invitation had only mentioned the Silver Star presentation, nothing else, and for a moment I wondered if this was some kind of routine closing remark, the kind every ceremony probably has. A general note about the importance of family support. Thank you for your service, drive safe tonight. He opened a different folder, smaller, thinner, the kind that holds a single sheet of paper rather than a full report. The department maintains a caregiver recognition, he said, awarded to family members who support a wounded service member through a long and difficult recovery, without seeking recognition, compensation, or public credit for their role in it. It is not awarded every year. It is only awarded when a nomination meets a very specific standard, and this year one did. He looked down at the paper in his hand. This year's recipient drove herself on her own time and her own gas money every single weekend for 4 consecutive months, 3 hours each way, to sit with a soldier who could not yet hold a pen steady enough to write her own name. She asked for nothing in return. She has not, to this day, ever mentioned this to anyone as though it were something remarkable, though it was. He said my aunt's name. She didn't move at first. I don't think she processed it as being about her. Not right away. Not until the camera operator stationed near the stage swung the lens toward our row and she caught herself suddenly on the screen bolted above the stage, her own face confused and unprepared in high definition for the entire room and everyone watching at home to see. That's you, I said quietly. Go. She looked at me like she needed permission, or maybe just confirmation that this was real and not some mistake that was about to be corrected. I nodded. She stood, still holding her purse in both hands like she might need to leave quickly, and walked up the aisle toward the stage while the room applauded. A warm and genuine sound that felt different from the earlier applause, less formal, more surprised. The general met her at the podium. He shook her hand, said something to her I couldn't quite hear from where I sat, and then handed her a plaque and a sealed envelope. She held both like she wasn't sure which one required more careful handling. Open it, he said to her gently, and she did, right there on stage, her hands shaking slightly as she worked the seal. Inside was a letter explaining that the department, in partnership with a private foundation that funds this particular recognition, had established a scholarship fund in her name at the community college, where she'd taught for 2 decades. It wasn't a one-time payment. It was an endowment, structured to keep generating scholarships for students in her department for years, decades. Long after this ceremony was a memory to everyone in the room. Her name would be on the fund permanently. Students she would never meet, studying subjects she'd spent her career teaching, would benefit from something set into motion because she drove 6 hours a week to sit in a hospital room with a crossword puzzle. She didn't cry on stage. She held it together with the kind of composure I think comes from decades of standing in front of a classroom and understanding that falling apart isn't always an option available to you in the moment, even when it should be. She thanked the general, thanked the room, said a few words about how she'd never expected anything for what she considered simply the correct way to treat someone you love, and then she walked back down the aisle to her seat beside me, and it was only once she sat down that the composure finally cracked. She cried in the chair, quietly, dabbing at her eyes with the edge of a tissue someone behind us had passed forward. I didn't do it for this, she kept saying under her breath, like she needed me to understand that the recognition hadn't been the point. I didn't do any of it for this. I know, I said. That's exactly why they gave it to you. The ceremony wrapped up shortly after, the actual Silver Star presentation happening almost as an afterthought by comparison, though it mattered plenty to me, standing at attention while the medal was pinned to my uniform, the weight of it settling against the fabric in a way that felt both ceremonial and strangely small compared to what had just happened to the woman sitting in the front row. Afterward, in the lobby, people came up to both of us. Officers shook my aunt's hand. A few of the press credential holders asked if she'd be willing to give a short statement, and she declined politely, saying this wasn't really a story about her. My phone had been on silent through the whole thing, tucked into my jacket pocket, and I didn't check it until we were walking to the car. When I did, the screen was already lit up with notifications stacked on top of each other, more than I could read at a glance. My dad had found out. Somebody, a cousin most likely, had forwarded him a clip of the announcement, and it had reached him roughly 40 minutes after the room had first applauded. That's when the calls started. I let the phone buzz in my pocket the entire walk to the car, and I let it buzz again while I helped my aunt into the passenger seat, and I let it buzz a third time while I walked around to the driver's side and got in myself. By the time we pulled out of the lot, there were already a dozen missed calls stacked on the screen, and more coming in every few minutes, an unbroken stream of them the entire drive back toward the city. I didn't answer a single one. My aunt watched the phone light up on the dashboard mount, glanced at me, and I just shrugged and kept driving because there was nothing in any of those calls that needed an answer from me that night. I didn't call my dad back that night, or the next day, or the week after. The missed calls kept coming for a few days and then tapered off into occasional texts, most of which I didn't read past the first line, which was usually some variation of the same accusation, that I'd embarrassed the family, that I'd chosen a stranger over my own blood, that I owed him an apology for how the whole thing had looked on television. I want to be clear that none of what happened next changed changed how I felt about that first part. My dad's absence from that hospital room and from the 4 months that followed was real, and no amount of context I learned later made it less real. But something did happen, about 3 weeks after the ceremony, that changed how I understood what had actually taken place on that stage. And I think it's worth telling honestly, because it complicated a story I'd assumed I already understood completely. It started with a letter, not an email, an actual letter delivered to my aunt's apartment, forwarded to me because it had my name on the outer envelope, even though the letter inside was addressed to both of us. It came from the foundation that partners with the Department on the Caregiver Recognition, the private organization that actually funds the scholarship endowments rather than the department itself, which mostly handles the ceremonial side. The letter was a formality mostly, thanking us both for participating in the recognition, outlining some administrative details about how the scholarship fund would be managed going forward, who to contact with questions. But near the bottom, there was a paragraph that stopped me. It thanked us for the nomination materials submitted on my aunt's behalf, and it mentioned, almost in passing, that the committee had been particularly moved by the specificity and detail in the nomination packet, describing it as one of the most thorough submissions they'd received in the program's history. I hadn't submitted a nomination. I'd never even heard of this recognition program before the general announced it from the stage. I assumed, reading that line, that there had been some mistake, some clerical error, a nomination attributed to the wrong person. I called the foundation's office the next morning. A woman there, kind and a little apologetic once she understood my confusion, explained that nominations for the caregiver recognition can be submitted by anyone with direct knowledge of the caregiving relationship, a fellow service member, a medical provider, a family friend, not necessarily the wounded service member themselves. She said the program specifically encourages third-party nominations because caregivers themselves rarely nominate the people who cared for them, and the people being cared for aren't always in a position, medically or emotionally, to do the paperwork. So someone else nominated her? I said, not me. That's right, she said. Would you like to know who? I said yes before I'd fully considered whether I actually wanted the answer. She said she couldn't release identifying details over the phone without written consent from the nominator, since some people prefer to remain anonymous even after their nominee has been selected. But she could tell me the nomination had come from someone listed as a colleague of mine, someone who had submitted alongside a letter from a hospital physical therapist corroborating several of the details. A colleague, not my mother, not my brother, not anyone in my family at all. I sat with that for a long moment after I hung up the phone. Someone I'd served with, someone who knew enough about those 4 months to write what the foundation was calling one of the most thorough submissions in the program's history, had gone through the effort of documenting my aunt's weekly drives, her presence in that hospital room, the crossword books, all of it, and had submitted it to a foundation I'd never heard of, on behalf of a woman they may never have even met in person. I didn't know who would have had that information. I didn't know who would have cared enough to compile it, and I realized, sitting there with the letter in my hand, that I needed to find out. I called the foundation back a few days later, after I'd had time to think it through, and asked what it would take to get the nominator's identity released to me directly. The woman I spoke with explained that if the nominator had checked a box allowing their identity to be shared with the nominee's family upon request, she could tell me right then. If they hadn't, she'd need to reach out to them first and get explicit permission. She put me on hold for a few minutes. When she came back, she said the nominator had, in fact, left a note attached to their submission, specifying that they were comfortable being identified if I ever asked, but that they hadn't wanted to reach out proactively because they didn't want the recognition to feel like it was coming with strings attached, or like they were trying to insert themselves into a moment that belonged to my aunt. Their name is on the file as a fellow service member, she said. Would you like me to read you their statement? It's part of the nomination packet, and they've given permission for you to see the whole thing. I said yes. What she read me was several paragraphs long, written in a voice I didn't recognize at first, careful and specific in a way that suggested someone who had thought hard about every sentence before committing to it. It described, in detail I hadn't provided to anyone, my aunt's visits, the crossword books, the way she'd read clues aloud on the days my hands weren't steady, the 3-hour drive each way, every weekend for 4 straight months without a gap. It described things I hadn't told this person directly, at least not that I remembered, which meant they'd learned it some other way. Near the end of the statement, there was a paragraph that explained how the nominator had come to know these details in the first place. It said they had been assigned, during my recovery, to check in periodically with soldiers from our unit who were undergoing extended medical treatment. As part of an informal peer support arrangement, some units run for exactly this reason. They said they'd visited me twice during those 4 months, at times when my aunt happened to also be there, and had watched the two of us work through those crossword puzzles together on afternoons when I could barely hold my own head up from the medication. I remembered those visits, vaguely, in the specific, hazy way I remember most of that period. I remembered a fellow soldier from my unit stopping by a couple of times, someone lower ranking, someone I hadn't served with directly, but who'd been on the same base, part of the broader unit structure that extended beyond my specific squad. I remembered them being quiet, mostly, sitting in the chair by the window while my aunt and I worked through the crossword, occasionally offering an answer neither of us had thought of. I hadn't thought about those visits in years. I certainly hadn't thought they'd amount to anything beyond a colleague being kind during a hard stretch, the kind of gesture that happens in the military more often than people outside it realize, small and unremarked and easily forgotten by everyone except, apparently, the person who made it. Can I have their contact information? I asked, so I can thank them directly. There was a pause on the line. I can pass along a message, she said, but I should mention something first. The service member who submitted this nomination passed away 8 months ago. It wasn't combat related. It was a training accident, stateside, unrelated to any deployment. The nomination was actually submitted a few weeks before that happened, and it sat in our review queue for longer than usual because of some paperwork delays on our end. We didn't get to processing it until after the ceremony schedule for this year was already being finalized, which is part of why the recognition ended up attached to your Silver Star ceremony specifically. It was honestly something of a coincidence of timing that made it land the way it did. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I don't think I could have, even if I'd wanted to. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you, she said. I wasn't sure if you already knew. I told her I hadn't known. I asked if I could have the name anyway, even though there was no longer anyone to thank in person, because I wanted to know who this was. Wanted to be able to put a full name to the quiet person who used to sit by the window and offer crossword answers on afternoons I barely remember. She gave me the name, and for a moment it meant nothing. Unfamiliar in the way names from a large unit blur together, unless you served alongside someone directly. I thanked her, hung up, and sat at my kitchen table with the name written on scrap paper, trying to place it against a vase. It took most of the evening, and when it arrived, it came all at once, less like recalling a fact than a door swinging open on a room I'd forgotten was in the house. The soldier who nominated my aunt had been someone I barely knew, attached to a different platoon, connected to me mostly through a mutual friend, but there was a specific reason they'd been assigned to check in on me during recovery, a reason that had nothing to do with any formal program. Years before any of this soldier had served alongside the man from my unit who didn't make it home the day of the checkpoint explosion. They'd trained together early in their careers and stayed in touch after being assigned to different units. When that soldier died in the explosion that broke my arm, this person, someone I barely knew, asked to be the one who checked in on the rest of us who survived it, not out of any official obligation, but because it was the only thing they felt they could still do for a friend who wasn't there to do it himself. I hadn't known any of this. I hadn't known that the quiet person by the window offering the occasional crossword answer was there partly because of a friendship I knew nothing about, a private grief underneath a visit I'd assumed was routine kindness from a stranger. I found a mailing address for the soldier's mother, listed on a memorial page maintained by a veterans organization, and wrote her a letter explaining what her child had done, the nomination, the quiet persistence of it, the fact that it had resulted in an endowed scholarship fund that would outlast all of us. She wrote back a few weeks later. Her child had never mentioned the nomination, had never mentioned much of their service, the way a lot of them don't. She was grateful to know this piece of it now, that something had come from that friendship and loss beyond the grief it left in her house. The version of the story where the department had simply noticed my aunt's devotion and decided to honor it turned out to be smaller and stranger than that. It wasn't an institution recognizing a pattern. It was one grieving person, still alive at the time, spending some of their limited remaining time documenting someone else's kindness in the name of a friend who could no longer do it themselves. None of this changed what my dad had done in that kitchen or in the hospital room 3 years earlier. My dad's absence was still his absence. The 49 missed calls were still an attempt to manage optics, not genuine concern for how any of it had felt to me or my aunt, but it changed how I thought about the day. I'd assume the sharpest contrast in that room was between my dad's absence and my aunt's presence, a man who wore the right jacket for the wrong reasons against a woman who never asked for anything. That's still the truest thing I know about that family. What I hadn't understood was that there was a third presence in that room too, invisible at the time, belonging to someone who died 8 months earlier in a training accident that would never get its own ceremony. Just a quiet act, completed before their death, that neither my aunt nor I knew anything about until a letter arrived asking about a nomination I never submitted. I called my dad about 6 weeks later, not because the 49 missed calls had earned a response, but because I wanted him to know the day hadn't just been about him losing a seat. It had been about something larger than either of us. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet, then said, "That's a hell of a thing." About as close as he's ever come to admitting something existed outside his own concerns. "I still think you were wrong," he added a moment later. "About the seat. About all of it." "I know you do," I said. "I called because I thought you should know the whole story." He didn't apologize. It would be a tidier ending if he had. He asked a few more questions about the fund, about my aunt, and the call wound down without resolution, the way our calls usually do. My aunt still doesn't like to talk about the ceremony much. When people ask about the fund, she deflects toward her students, the specific kids who've received awards from it since. She likes the fund existing as something useful in other people's lives, rather than a story about her own. I visit her more now, not because anything between us fundamentally changed, but because the day made something already true harder to ignore. Showing up consistently without asking for credit is rarer than it should be. A few months later, I drove out to visit the mother of the soldier who'd submitted the nomination. She'd invited me after our letters back and forth, said she'd like to meet the person her child had gone out of their way to help. Her house was small, on a quiet street. She made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table while she brought out a box of photographs. Training days pictures, holidays I had no context for, but that she narrated anyway. Near the bottom of the box was one I hadn't expected. My aunt and me in the hospital room, hunched over a crossword book, taken from the doorway at an angle that suggested whoever took it hadn't wanted to interrupt. Neither of us was looking at the camera. My aunt was pointing at something in the puzzle, laughing at an answer we'd clearly gotten wrong, and I was mid-sentence, my broken arm resting on a pillow beside me. They took this on one of the visits, the mother said, turning it over in her hands. I found it on their phone after. I didn't know what it was of until your letter came. I just knew it was something they'd kept. I asked if I could have a copy. She said she'd already had one printed, waiting in an envelope by the door. I have that photograph on my kitchen counter now, propped against a mug my aunt gave me years ago. I look at it most mornings while I make coffee. The two of us caught mid-laugh over a puzzle neither of us could solve, unaware that someone was standing in the doorway, quietly deciding that this specific, unremarkable afternoon was worth remembering long after everyone in the room had forgotten it themselves.